So, hello everybody. Thanks very much. I heard that in the audience there are some officials from the university. I don't know them personally, or only a few. So, welcome everybody, but also welcome to the bachelor or master students. Thanks for the invitation, Philippe. Thanks for the opportunity to give a presentation here. And the topic is forest dynamics from monospecific to mixed species stance. I had to prepare that very quickly, but I hope it will be of some use. And I want to start with this picture. At many places or in many regions of the world, forest management follows the principle of segregation. So that means there are areas which are completely unmanaged, where there are the elephants or the tigers in Bangladesh or the bears in Spain, and where there are maybe national parks and no management at all. And in some areas in the same country there are the harvesters harvesting the trees, and that is in many countries that is completely segregated. So that means national park and recreation and hiking here, and timber use in other regions. But yesterday we talked a little bit about that during the defense. There was a question from the colleague from Morocco. And in Central Europe, in many countries, we follow not the principle of segregation, but the principle of integration. So we want a lot from the forest. We want the trees against rockfall, we want the drinking water, and we want biodiversity, but we also would want to have biomass and wood and recreation and carbon fixation, so everything in one pack. So that is a principle of integration that we want. And of course, sometimes there are some waves. Sometimes everybody is talking about biodiversity, so one aspect is increased, and then 5 years later, all the funding is given for carbon, and then afterwards, again, nitrogen deposition, that should be reduced. So there are some waves, but the principle is always the same, that is a thinking of integration, to have a couple of different functions and services in one forest, and the people in there, and the animals, and the bioenergy, so the combination. And that is this other principle, the segregation and the integration principle. And the European countries, they agreed, these 40 European states, they agreed on the 6 criteria for this integrative management. So they said, we want to have from a forest maintenance of the forest area and stock, so there should not be motorways or industrial areas everywhere and the forest cut. The forest should be healthy and there should be vitality. Forest growth, yield and wood production, biological diversity, protective functions and socio-economical functions. So that means we want to have an integration and multi-purpose forestry. So we want to have a lot of different functions, and that are the main 6 functions. That is from the result from the Helsinki and Warsaw process. And in US and Canada, they have the same from the Montreal process. They also have the First Nations, so they have a 7th criteria, and that is a First Nation issue. So we don't have that in Central Europe, as we already solved this, awfully. And so that means 50 years ago, if somebody in Bavaria cut a tree, then he mainly thought on growth and yield and wood production. So 1 cubic meter is presently €100 or something like this. And now when there is coming somebody with a chainsaw to a tree, he should in principle think of everything. So he should think, what if I cut the tree? What am I doing regarding maintenance of forest area? Do I decrease the forest area? He should think about health and vitality. Does that mean that I destabilize the stand as I cut a tree at the border and maybe the others will fall down? And of course, he should also think of the cubic meters and of the tons of biomass, as the buildings should be heated and we need the energy and do not want to import that from Brazil, for example. We should think of biological diversity before we use a chainsaw. So is there a hole of a woodpecker or is there a special biotope? We should think of the protective function and also of the socio-economical functions. And the monospecific stands of the past, like you see here, they are not so optimal for this multi-purpose forestry. So they provide, for example, wood production, and in the past also some children were playing in the forest. For example, you see here the speaker of today. It was an age of 2, so you see that he is socialized in monospecific stands. Yeah, that are the post-war stands in Germany, and that is spruce everywhere, spruce area, 50–70%. Of course, now it is a lot criticized, but that no seeds were available, no plants were available after the Second World War, so they planted spruce everywhere, and they now prove to be not the best for multi-purpose integrative forestry. There are some problems. And that, for example, is the acid rain problem. And it hit a lot the monospecific stands, much more than the mixed stands, as mixing always means risk distribution, and some survive. And for example, here the monospecific stands are very prone to wind throw. For example, that is a picture by Magnus Löw. He gave me that picture, and he said that in this area they make more money by carrying the people, busloads of people, to take photos of these fallen trees than they make by the timber. The people use that as a kind of negative eco-tourism. And here you see the bark beetle problem in some areas of Bavaria and drought problems in the northeast of Germany. And that means that the monospecific stands of the past, at least in Central Europe, they prove to be not very stable and not so useful for this concept of multi-purpose integrative forestry. And now, of course, there is a tendency to move from monospecific stands, here you see on the left, to mixed species stands. As if you have a mixture, for example, of 3 species, you have a lot of this in Spain too, then maybe one species will be damaged by some biotic or abiotic pathogens, but maybe the other will survive, and that can maybe compensate some of the functions and services of the dropout species. And so the mixed species stands, so presently we have mainly even-aged mixed species stands. They are already a little bit more resilient and resistant compared to the monospecific stands. And now a lot of forest enterprises and also state forests, they tend toward mixed species, uneven-aged stands. So that means you do not only have 2 or 3 species mixed in the same layer, but you have different layers, and that is again maybe an advantage. So if some of the dominant trees are wind-blown, then you don't start from the scratch again, as you do not need to plant, you do not have these carbon problems or these nitrogen problems in the groundwater by the open area, but you have maybe a second layer or a third layer that can compensate for the losses of the dominant trees. Or the other way around, if you have some browsing animals in the understory, they at least we have no giraffes also here. And that means I tried now to show you that certainly you know the concept of integrative and multi-purpose functional forest management. That is a paradigm which is presently still very, very popular in Central Europe, and that the shift from monospecific to more complex forest stands is mainly motivated by getting a higher resilience, resistance, and recovery by the stand. But of course, these more complex stands also need better understanding of the dynamics, better prediction tools, more scientific analysis to understand. Of course, if you mix, then a lot of new aspects emerge. Yesterday we had the defense of Diego de Prado here in this room, and he worked about this, and there are many PhD students. For example, I know several from Philippe's group. They all try to get access to the dynamics of mixed species stands to better understand. The shape of the trees may be different, the growth curves may be different, the soil system, the turnover may be different, and I now want to address 3 challenges of mixed species stands, and that is the competition regulation of mixed species stands, and the species-specific growing space provision, and the density regulation. And that means now the series of nice photos is over, and typical for growth and yield, now the series of graphs start. Yeah. And here I try to abstract the dynamics of monospecific stands and by the height trajectories. Here you see that in monospecific stands that are even-aged, one species, one age, there is a bunch of height curves, and that they are more or less Gaussian distributed, so it's very easy to understand, very easy to predict, and the textbooks are full of this. That is the main, what we learned about forest dynamics. Monospecific stands, easy to predict, quite easy to understand. But if we move already to mixed species stand which are even-aged, but which have a little bit different height trajectory. For example, species 1 is maybe a bit slower at the beginning and then faster later, and species 2 starts quickly and then is a little bit delayed, then it already becomes a bit more complicated. And here you have even different ages. So species 1 starts and species 2 starts 20 years later or something like this. And here on the right-hand side, you see the system of a selection forest where every individual is different in age. So you have a mixture of species and of ages. And of course, that is more challenging to understand, to predict than this approach here. And if you, for example, do not do anything, for example, if the Forest Service reduces the number of workers and professionals and silviculturists or managers, then that is maybe not so problematic for these kinds of stands, as the tree species will survive even if you do not manage. Maybe there will be acid rain or storm or something like this, but you probably will not so easily use one species. But in this case here, or in those cases here, if you don't regulate, then maybe on the long, this species number 2 will not survive, as it gets suppressed by species number 1. So presently we have a tendency that we go to more complex stands, which need more regulation, but at the same time the Forest Service reduces the number of employers, and at least in my country, and that is a little bit problematic. So we want a lot of forests, many functions, much more than in the past, but at the same time we reduce the staff to manage that. So we have more complicated, to manage a forest stand by clear cut is not so complicated. But to manage a mixed species stands or a selection forest, that is a bit more complicated. And I think it's also good for forest scientists and for forest education that we move a little bit from very easy to manage stand to a bit more complicated, as there are also other subjects at universities, like medical science or physics, which deal a bit more with a little bit more complicated things than clear cuts. So I think also forest science could move to a bit more complex approaches to their favorite subjects, to forest stands. And how to do now if you have such stands here with 2 species which are a little bit critical to manage. So for example, what could happen? That are 2 examples that are a little bit problematic if you do not care for the different species. And that is one example from the Harz Mountains, where they established a lot of mixed stands of Norway spruce and European beech. And in those stands, it is often like this, that are the height curves here. So that is a height curve of European beech, this green, and that is a height curve of Norway spruce. And the height curves in Central Europe are very important, as the systems are often light limited, so the water is sufficient, but the light is the critical resource. And that means if you have stands like this mixed stand, then on the long you always have to help the beech. And here what they did, that is a long-term experiment plot managed by Spellmann in Göttingen. And you see here what they had to do in order to keep the beech in the mixture. They all the time had to reduce the standing volume, that is a standing volume here in cubic meter per hectare. They had to reduce and reduce and reduce in the mixed stand the standing volume of Norway spruce in order to keep the beech in the stand, as otherwise the Norway spruce would overtop the beech, and then finally the beech, which is essential for the mixture. In Germany we say that the mother of the forest, as it improves the turnover, would vanish. So that means if you have a good idea to mix and you simply mix without thinking, without planning, it might happen that you afterwards have a lot of work to remedy the problem you caused if you mix in a wrong way. And here you see the same. We have a lot of mixture of European beech and sessile oak. And at the beginning, so that means in the first 50 years, the system of oak is normally 150 to 180 years until they have a diameter of 50 or 60 centimeters and they get harvested. So that means the first 50 years it goes well. But then often if you mix in the wrong way, the beech becomes higher than the oak, and then you have to act somehow. Either you have to harvest the oak very early, but that is stupid, and then you lose a lot of money, as the oak is normally the valuable species you want to have, or you have to reduce the beech in order to keep the oak. If you simply let the system run, you will finally lose the oak. And that means if mixture, the idea of mixture is good, but that needs also some thinking and some planning. And one aspect is a very, very nice, simple approach is to look for the height curves of the different species. And you see that there are some species, here's a lot of species, it doesn't matter which species, but you see that some are quick and others are slow. And if you see that if you mix 2 species with different speeds of height growth, then that can be that you can identify that one species will overtop the other, and if that are even species which are not shade tolerant, then it is important to do maybe two different strategies. And one is to separate them a little bit in groups, for example, and that means a spatial separation. So then it doesn't mean that you turn toward monospecific stands, but you at least, when you establish the stand, that maybe if you mix two species which are very competitive and you mix them in individual tree mixture, that means maybe you lose already after 10 or 20 years, you lose one species. But if you establish them in groups or troops or clusters, that means you can keep them as they will not outcompete each other so easily. So that is one approach, and that is a spatial separation when establishing the stands. And another possibility, another approach is a temporal separation, that you give one species, for example, 20 years ahead. That you try, for example, if you would establish these two species here at the same time, you know that you will get a problem at that age here where this vertical line is. But if you give species number 2 a delay of 20 years, then you can remedy this intersection of the height curves, and that means they do not compete so much with each other in that later phase of maybe age 80 or age 100. So that are the two principles, the spatial and the temporal separation. So that was the first aspect of management of mixed species. A second aspect, there will be 3 altogether. I mentioned 3, only 3 over a lot, but the second aspect is the species-specific growing space provision. And that means, what I want to show you with this photo is that there are some species you know very well, which have very slim crowns, which need maybe even at an age of 100 or so, they need only 50 or 60 square meter as growing space. And there are other trees, for example, like beech or maple, they need 3-fold or 4-fold the space. So, and in monospecific stands, it's the same. You don't have to consider that. When you see here on the right side the graph, there is a stem diameter from 10 to 110. And here is the growing space requirement, the square meter a tree needs to live. And then you see that there are some species like Norway spruce, they need 50, and others, they need 200 or so. And of course, that has to be considered. If you mix in monospecific stands, it's very easy. You can calculate the final number of trees after 100 years, as every tree needs more or less the same space, as it's the same species. But if you mix, then of course, here for 2 species, for example, you have a different number of target trees. So after 100 years, maybe only 40 beeches can survive, but 300 spruces. And the number of target trees, if you define them for silvicultural prescriptions, need to consider the different growing space requirements. And they, of course, depend on this mixing proportion. So that is, the target number is different. And also, if you thin, they need different distances. So if you mix 2 species with different growing space requirements, of course, the distance when you select future crop trees or when you release the trees and cut away the next 1 or 2 neighbors, that is very different in case of beech and in case of spruce, and also in case of spruce and beech stand. And if you generalize that, you can lose a lot of growing space and a lot of carbon sequestration. And that means also the guidelines for thinning. The guidelines for thinning in this reform project, we defined thinning prescriptions. And then we started to define, for example, guidelines for mixed stands for thinning. And that means in case of mixed stands, you need different curves for the 2 species. And the curves also, these density guidelines, they depend on the mixing proportion. And in order to make that somehow feasible, so that you can somehow consider that one species needs more or less space than the other, we invented these equivalence coefficients, where you have one species and the other species, and you can say one species is an equivalent of 4.3 of the other species in terms of growing space. So that makes that somehow comparable, and it makes it possible to calculate. For example, if you say, I want finally have a mixture of 20% of pinus and 80% of beeches, you can calculate how many trees will that be. As it's not 20/80 in terms of tree number, it will be different, as it has to be weighted by the growing area, by the growing space. So that was a second, these equivalence coefficients, not very complicated, but I think it's important in the past that many traditional foresters will say it's too complicated, we cannot use. But I think we should get used to, and our students also should get used to a bit more complex approaches to thinning and to selection of initial spacing and attending and so on. A third aspect, that is the stand density regulation. Competition reduction facilitation can improve packing density and over-yielding. So if you mix two species, there can be a lot of different interactions. So that, for example, can be if you mix here very placative two species that have complementary crown shapes and the resource supply is sufficient, they can be simply denser packed. So there can be more species on one area. And there can be also light complementarity, so that it can be that if you have some more transparent trees in the above ground, in the dominant layer, like pine, for example, and beech or abies also in the lower layer, then there can be also mixtures which pack the canopy space more densely and can better exploit the available space above ground. And below ground, it's the same. The main concepts, which are quite well understood now, are the positive effects, for example, of the hydraulic redistribution, that deep-rooting species can pump up water, and that water is given to the xylem of the soil, and then another species can tap that and use it for improving the water supply. And the nutrients upwards transport is very well known, that a deep-rooting species, for example, like Douglas fir or like silver fir, they can access deeper layers, maybe 1 meter or so, or 1.5 meters, and transport upwards the nutrients, and then by the leaves, some of the nutrients are socialized between the other trees. So that means that is also a benefit of mixture. And another benefit, very well known, is if you mix a tree species which is able to fix nitrogen, atmospheric nitrogen, for example, like alder or robinia, and there is a limitation of nitrogen of another species, so that can improve the life of both species. And I show this above and below ground courses of improvement in order to explain this graph here. And you see here in monospecific stands, maybe you know that graph very well. So if in monospecific stands, you can have a density from a very low density in the stand, so only 5 trees per hectare, or a very high density in the stand, maybe 100 trees or 200 trees. And so if you reduce the density, then the growth reaction, so the productivity per hectare and year, for example, or tons per hectare and year, is normally somehow reduced in following this line, this Mitscherlich curve. Or even Assmann showed that there can be even an increase. So if you have the maximum stand density and you cut away 10 or 20%, there can even be a little bit more growth than under fully stocked conditions. But then it goes down, the productivity goes down. And if we use this curve now for mixed species stand, if we simply transfer that to mixed species stand, as we know that the textbooks are describing these curves for a lot of species in monospecific constellations very well. If we use this for mixed stands, that can be very disadvantageous, as the mixed stands can be denser by 10 to 25%. That is just a frame shown for 10 species combinations we analyzed in Central Europe and also in Spain. So there are stands in Spain included in this frame here. So that means they can be denser, mixed species stands. The maximum stand density can be higher because of the shown facilitation and complementarity effect. And also the growth can be higher by 10 to 35%. Yesterday we learned that in some cases the productivity can be even 100% higher. But so that 10 or 35 is still a quite conservative approach. And also this year, these 10 to 25 is a conservative approach of the effect of mixture. And that means if we follow, when we develop guidelines for mixed stands and we assume the traditional curves for monospecific stands, we may underestimate the potential of the density and we may underestimate the productivity. So we could, in the silvicultural guidelines, we could select, for example, more future crop trees, maybe 20 more per hectare, as that is a lot. And we even can expect from these 20 more trees and the other 100 a higher productivity. And that is important to know, as if you don't consider that, you lose density and productivity. And in terms of carbon sequestration, that is very important, as that are millions of hectares. So on millions of hectares in our country, it is my perception in Central Europe, presently we are managing on a quite low density level. And it comes from the idea of quality improvement, that we want to have 100 very, very high quality, tall, high quality trees. And if we transfer this principle now to mixed species stands, that can be very disadvantageous, so that as they could be denser, the stands, the number of crop trees could be higher, and also the productivity, even if we increase the density, the productivity and the carbon sequestration could be higher. I do not know if you are you familiar with these crop tree ideas? Also, yeah, that is complete. Oh, I don't know the audience, but maybe you think what he's talking about, crop trees. Yeah, but what I want to say is that we have a lot of knowledge, and that is probably the same below ground processes that are based on monospecific stands, and we should invest a lot of energy and research into extending that to mixed species stand if we want to manage them smart in the future. And now one step further. That so far I talked about age-class forest, so that means monospecific stands or mixed stands, even-aged, more or less even-aged, but now we even move many forest owners, also private owners and state forest owners, they move to these stands which are mixed and uneven age, so which combine 3 species or 4 species, and they also combine different ages. And that means also a very, very strong extension of the mixing idea even to more complex forests. And that means in the past we had this patchwork of 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years segregated in the area. And now if we integrate all this, that means we have stands where you have young and tall trees, 2, 3, 4 species mixed very closely together. And that is now a topic, the transition from monocultures to selection forests. You see there, I'm close to the end. There are only 4 slides missing now, and it's possible still to concentrate, as then it's over. And it is very important, as I heard that you record the talk, that some of the pictures are not my pictures, and the credits should also be documented. Otherwise, maybe I get problems. I don't know. Yeah, but the transition from monoculture to selection forest, and that is the topic now, and that, in order to show the challenge, I start again with a monospecific approach or with an even age approach. That is the time frame here. That is the end of the rotation, maybe 150 years or 120 years. And that is a standing stock in cubic meters per hectare and year. And in the monospecific stands, that was very boring. So it was like this, that the standing volume accumulated and accumulated and accumulated, and then maybe you did a clear cut, or in the last 20, 30 years they started to cut not at one point in time, but in 2 or 3 points in time, this threshold diameter cutting that you first cut, you always cutted the trees which were above 60 centimeters or something like this. But in principle, it was like this, that there was a strong accumulation, and then within 20 years or so, you finally reduce to the scratch to start again. And that is the typical age class principle, and the transition to the selection forest now, this idea, a lot of people from Finland to probably to Spain follow that now, that you of course start somewhere, or you have stands which started as more or less even aged, and then already at an age of 40 or 50, and I saw that also in Spain at some places, you start to reduce. So that means at that age, where in the age class forest you still accumulated for the next 50 years the capital to have a standing stock, a high standing stock, you already start to reduce. You go down and down and down and down with a standing volume, and at the same time, when you go down, maybe in the even age stands, you underplant a first cohort, or there comes a natural regeneration, a second cohort, or a third and a fourth cohort, and that means you have at the same time still something in the dominant layer, but you also already establish something below. And if the wind does not blow it down, this standing stock, then on the long you start from a Gaussian stem diameter distribution. Here you only have one cohort, and they are all more or less the same age, and then you already have maybe a second cohort under the dominant cohort, and then you have 2 or 3 cohorts, and then you finally have a transition from this Gaussian tree number distribution to an exponential tree number distribution. And that means a transition from the even age forest to a selection forest. And that is an approach which is now very much discussed, and a lot of people establish that in their forests. And why? Why do that? They do that as they think that these trees here, where you go to with these different layers, with different cohorts, that they can maybe provide a wider bunch of forest services, and they can be more stable. And even if there is a total loss of dominant trees, you have cohorts below that are already in the next year after the storm or in the next year after the bark beetle attack. They already produce again, so they buffer somehow. Of course, there are not only advantages, there are also disadvantages, but that is the main principle. And on the long, the idea is to go to something like this, that you have not this sawtooth curve with accumulating, not this here, with this accumulating standing volume and then down and accumulating again of the even age forest, the age class forest, but that you have always more or less the same standing volume per hectare, maybe always 250, or in pine stands always 220. Of course, with some waves, as you also seen, but that you have a continuous covered forestry, where you always have trees, always young ones, and middle high, and old ones. And on sites which are very poor, the standing stock is low, and on very fertile sites, maybe the density is higher, and also the standing volume is higher. And in order to manage that, then the guidelines are no longer these classical guidelines where you have the number of trees and the mean diameter, but you manage no longer these stands as one cohort, but you have often for those trees these exponential curves, the tree diameter, and that is not the mean tree diameter as in monospecific stands. That is a diameter of the trees in the stand. So at all times you have a lot of small trees, very few tall trees, and a medium number of medium-sized trees. And on the long, such curves, such steady state curves of standing volume can be managed if you cut thin in a way that you always keep the stand close to an exponential curve. That is only an idea. Of course, that can be differently. That can be a belly-shaped curve, but the principle is shown here. That is in log. If we have this exponent, no, that should not. That should be. There's a mistake I just see. But here, I can explain it here, that here you have the number of trees, and here you have the diameter classes, and here it is a logarithmic scale, and here it is a linear scale, and the idea is to always cut those trees, or mainly cut there where the curve does not follow the exponential curve. So, for example, if you have here too many small trees, maybe then on the long, this exponential curve will be modified, and you lose this steady state situation, and then you cut mainly here. And if you have an overflow in the high diameter classes, you mainly cut in the high diameter classes. But the idea is to manage the stand in a way that you, on the long, you always have a never-ending system of tall trees, small trees, and medium-sized trees, always in a balanced number beside each other. And one idea is to use this exponential curve for this management. That is correct here, but that should not be a logarithm here. Yeah, so that should be linear here. Okay, I summarize the starting point where integration versus segregation, multifunctionality versus wood dominance. And we see that in many countries in Europe, we follow this principle of integration and of multifunctionality. And the states, in several cases now, support that the state pays So during the financial crisis, there was nothing paid, but now they start again to pay. If you, the forest owners, the private forest owners, if they leave 2 tall trees standing per hectare, they get some 50 euro per year and hectare for these trees in order to support this multifunctionality. So far that was mainly done in agriculture, but now it's already done in forestry. That people get some subsidy or kind of subsidies or rewards if they enrich the multifunctionality. Complex forests contribute to higher stability and better provision of forest functions and services. And biodiversity flying around here. But more complex forests also require advanced silvicultural prescriptions, and I try to point out only 3 challenges with this idea of separation and mixing in PETA, in spatial and temporal separation, and this idea of management of the growing space, and this idea of density and over-yielding management. Forest ecosystems are so valuable, they deserve smart management options, so that means we should realize that we want a lot of forests, we want much more of forests than in the past, and that means we also have to invest more research, more tools to have the toolbox for a better management. And I think that is very important, that by these bachelor theses and master theses and PhD studies going on here, they all should provide some pieces to that. As that is a huge, 80% of our knowledge is based on monospecific stance, I think, and each step forward is very important. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Hans. Now we have time for questions. So, everybody wants to address any question?
I think it was a bit too long, huh?
No.
I reduced the time.
No question, we can ask you. Don't be shy.
No question.
So, I don't know if you have microphone. Professor Fouad Mouni from MFI Morocco wants to pose a question.
Nowadays, the forest management planning methodology and process as going forward to get this kind of mixture. But I wonder if, because we don't have a lot of knowledge about how to, you said it in your presentation, how to deal with this mixture. Should we have a mixture in space or in time? And I'm wondering, is there any success story that have been proving this the successful way of this way of management?
I mean, of course, skillful forest practitioners know a lot how to manage mixtures. So it's not, but so far that is not very well represented in the management tools, in the forest planning tools. For example, if we want to develop silvicultural prescriptions, forest practitioners often do it by emotions, or not by emotion, but they think they know, they already know, and on the long that cannot work. Yeah? So that has to be quantitative, as otherwise you will not consider the different site conditions sufficiently enough, and that is on the level of silvicultural prescriptions, but also especially also on the level of enterprise. So I mean, in the past the enterprises were more or less managed by the H-class system. So they assumed the normal forest, the Hundeshagen formulas, and now if you have the selection forest, for example, that cannot work. So they are simply missing the concepts for that. And I think that is important to develop that quantitative concepts. As presently, I have the idea a lot of forest practitioners are willing to go towards mixed species stance. They understand the idea, but when they want to have some help, they often have the yield table or something like that, or have traditional methods, and that so presently the missing tools are the hurdles, are slowing down the transition. Is it some, yeah?
Small question about this. I have heard about this 10 years ago or 15 years ago, especially when I was studying, I was working in Belgium. They get with this concept that has been brought from France, talking about NeartoNature process. Is it possible to do this, and can it works or not? NeartoNature, because we have just simulating how the nature will do if we leave trees mixture, and naturally some trees will die, some trees will rise, and we have to simulate this process of nature to be able to do this management kind of things.
Yeah, I think I'm a bit skeptical with this idea of emulating the natural processes. I think that is sometimes, for example, there was a discussion that if we make clear cuts, that is okay as we emulate bark beetle and fire or so. Or if we do gap cuts, that is emulating the gap dynamics which normally is going on in Central Europe. So I'm a bit critical, as I think it's, for example, it's completely different if an old tree dies and falls down and already generates regeneration, and that is a process over a long time, or if you cut with a chainsaw within 1 year 2 or 3 gaps per hectare, that is a complete different dynamic. And so I think it is a wish to have at the same time close to nature processes and all the use of wood and whatever you want to have. But I think there is a possibility of some convergence on some sites. So I think but we should accept, and that I think we should accept that we want something for the forest, that we want to use the forest at least on some areas for the benefit of humans, and that is not always in line with nature. So we see that we could also say that COVID is very good as the biodiversity is promoted for the virus and for the bacteria and let it go, and so that is wonderful. And you see that there are some controversies between what nature wants and what humans want, and I would see it similar in forestry.
Another question, I think, and Federico has a question.
I think it's working. Thank you for your presentation. When you talk about mixed forest, it remember me the natural forest management in Brazil. Of course, little different. But right in the beginning, you was talking about the 4 pillars like biodiversity, recreation, water service. But there's not many people around. So and it's a private, most of the area, the forest, it's private. And they are worried about money. They want to harvest and make money. And the problem is some old projects like 30 years ago, they went there and harvest the biggest tree and supposed to left some seedlings, some young trees, small diameter trees, to come after 30 years and harvest again. And now it's time to go there again. It's past like 30 years, but when we do this kind of projects, it's not feasible. The wood there, the wood they want to harvest, it's not good, it's not with the right diameter. And what is your suggestion, what we could do like 30 years ago to make this cycling go straight for in the natural forest?
Yeah, but I think it's what your first comment was very important, that the people also need money, so they live from that probably. And these 6 criteria I mentioned, that is of course also a question of weighting. So which is given which weight, and in densely populated areas where you need recreation possibilities and water quality, as the drinking water is tapped from the forest area, these functions are mainly higher weighted than other functions. And in your special case, that sounds like this, that the excess regarding tourism or whatever, or recreation, is not so strong. So probably that will be lower weighted, and there will be lower demands on these purposes. But the special, how to transform that now, I think it's not so easy to say that, as you have to know the objective of the forest owner and the heuristic situation, so the law. Probably in Brazil you always also have a forest law which says what is allowed and what is not allowed. And then I think that is a question of negotiation. So it's not. I can say what could be feasible. I mean, what could be feasible? That could be possible to establish stands with 2 or 3 cohorts in those cases, and to have a threshold diameter cutting on the long. It sounds a bit like this, that you manage the stands in a way that you maybe cut not huge areas, but always a special number of trees above a given threshold diameter. But of course, that is what may be possible. But what you really do finally, that is a negotiation between the forest owner, the public, and within the frame of the forest law, I would say.
Okay,
is it an answer for?
Yes, I mean, just because they was expecting the growth by probably annual rings and stuff to growth to the next 30 years, they have the same forest again. Mm-hmm. But it's really different from now.
But you know the growth. I think an important step, of course, is to know the growth rates, that you have inventory plots and you know what you can expect in which time span. I think that is important.
Yeah, but only with the annual rings, because to install permanent plots in this area, it is...
You have not?
Yeah, it's really impossible. It's hard. Thank you, Professor.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I think we have close to time. You have just a small question and quick answer. It's how you told that we have 80% of our knowledge about temperate forests comes from even-age monospecific stand. And now you are open the ideas of more complex stand. So I want just to address to the audience, because I think could be interesting for the students especially, the accelerated effort to get empirical, experimental, and modeling data for this development in complex forests. So what
You mean how to get information?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that is for many purposes. It's always at least two lines, and one is the inventory data that is available to tap the existing inventories. And I mean not only the national forest inventories, but also the inventories of the enterprises, as they often have very valuable data. But then you often have missing some extreme situations which are extremely important for understanding and for model development. For example, in the inventory data, you often don't have solitary trees or stands which are very low in density, and you also have often not stands which are very high in density. You only have the stands where you do not know the history, and that means you, in addition to the inventory, I think there is always a second line, and that are experimental plots, long-term experimental plots. And especially experimental plots with extremes, with new things, different densities, different mixtures, but also new species. So I see that is important to have both lines, national or inventory data and experimental data. And a very, very important step, and there are several projects also between our institutions, is that we extend or we pool the data from different areas. So far it was often like this, that we had the inventory data from Germany, and then we have always medium conditions. So medium water supply, medium temperature and precipitation. And now we are going to merge data, the experimental data, and also the national inventory data, the national forest inventory data, along gradients, so that we have extremes from very dry to very wet and so on. But you wanted a short answer, so I stopped.
Okay, thank you. Maybe for the next talk. Thank you very much, Professor Hans Pretzsch,
thanks
for your talk.